Good evening and welcome to this Dymocks Chapter 1 event with British crime writer Peter James. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, wherever we are in Australia, and to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Sue Turnbull, and by day, I'm a professor of media and communication at the University of Wollongong. By night, I'm a reviewer of crime fiction for the Fairfax Press, board member of BAD, the Sydney Crime Writers Festival, and a judge for the Ned Kelly Awards for Australian crime fiction. And if that wasn't enough, I'm also an ambassador for Sisters in Crime Australia. And it's my absolute delight to be introducing the #1 UK best-selling author, Peter James. Wave, Peter. I'm going to do you an introduction in just
Hi. Thank you, Sue. Hi, everybody.
Hello. And if you're joining us tonight, you probably know Peter from his standalone crime fiction and for his wonderful series featuring Detective Superintendent Roy Grace. Peter is a #1 best-selling author. He has been translated into many languages. He's won more than 40 awards for his work, including the Crime Writers Association Diamond Dagger, a BAFTA award nomination. And I think you should be winning an award for your YouTube channel, Peter, because it's pretty cool.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, the YouTube channel's been huge fun doing, and the part of it I like best is what we call the Author's Studio, where I've interviewed about 150 authors, including Michael Connolly and Karen Slaughter, just about every Lee Child, asking them to give their kind of writing tips, and also to tell us if they have a guilty secret.
Yeah, look, I love it, and we also began our little conversation before we came on air by the fact that because I'd seen Peter in his natural surround with his animals and in his house, and I had this assumed intimacy. I felt I knew you quite intimately, and I think that's what those sorts of YouTube channels enable. They enable your readers to form a connection with you in quite complex ways, I think.
Yes, I think people know very little about the writers of the books they read, and my wife Laura thought it'd be kind of fun to actually just give an insight into how we actually live, I guess, beyond the pages of the books. And animals has always been a big part of our lives. We have alpacas, we have emus, pygmy goats, dogs, cats. And in a world that's kind of often pretty dark, seemingly these days, I remember about 2 years ago, you may have heard it in Australia, the horrible Manchester bombing, killing, it's an Al-Qaeda attack, killing about 80 people. Waking up to that news, and then I went out and I hand-fed the alpacas diced carrot and hand-fed the emus kind of grapes and blackberries, and it just grounds you. You think these lovely creatures, they don't know all the kind of horror that mankind sort of sometimes does in this strange world.
I think that's wonderful, and it comes out in your care for the animals that surround you. But where are you speaking to us from? Because I know you were born in Brighton, and Roy Grace is set in Brighton, but I believe you've had a recent change of location.
I have, yes. We still have a home just outside Brighton, but we moved to Jersey, the island of Jersey, about 2.5 years ago. It's the southernmost point of the British Isles. A number of reasons. I wanted a writing bolt hole. I was not happy with Brexit. And Jersey, although it's part of the British Isles, isn't part of the UK, so it's kind of separate from all that Brexit nonsense. Yeah. And Jersey is a stunningly beautiful place. I've always had a dream. I remember when I read that Yeats wrote at the top of a tower, and I was a big fan of Yeats when I was a kid. And I thought, I want to one day have a tower. And we found this house in Jersey with a 70-foot granite tower, and I'm in the top right now. I can see if the blinds were up behind me, I could see on a clear day across to St. Malo, where I believe you spent a lot of time in a former life. And I found Jersey inspirational. It's actually been home to a lot of writers over the years. Victor Hugo wrote Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame here. And so it's the island is inspirational. It's on the many times I've been to Australia, I've found the beauty of so many parts of Australia breathtaking and inspirational. Jersey has that same thing. There's rugged coastland. I'm a keen cyclist. There's 500 miles. It's only 9 miles by 5 miles long, but there's 500 miles of lanes that you can cycle down or run down. And I love seafood, and it's got its own oyster beds. It's just it's a beautiful place just to be away from everything.
So I Follow You, which is the book that we're going to be talking about tonight, and Dymocks is going to put a link in the chat so that you can actually purchase it from Dymocks if you are so inclined, and if you haven't got it already. But I Follow You is one of your standalone novels, and it's set in Jersey. So is this the first book set in Jersey?
It is. It's the first novel I've entirely set, if you like, in my new home. In the previous but one Roy Grace novel, Dead at First Sight, I had a villain living in Jersey. And so I had a number of scenes in Jersey. But I was really inspired to set I Follow You in Jersey because the book revolves around a kind of a stalking. And if it was in a big community like London with 8 million people, there isn't any kind of claustrophobia in that city. It is actually quite easy to get away from people. Whereas in Jersey, there's only 107,000 people. Oh, look at this lovely animal. Beautiful, on cue. You are going to keep meeting people. I remember when we first arrived, somebody said the main shopping street is a pedestrian mall called King Street. When we first arrived, a friend said, within 3 months, you will never walk down King Street without bumping into someone you know. And that really suits I Follow You because Georgia McLean, who's the victim in the stalking, never quite is able to get away from Marcus Valentine.
Okay, look, I think this is the moment to give us a little synopsis of the book. I mean, I've got to say that I think it's a really, really scary, wonderful, page-turning thriller. And we'll talk more about it as we go along. But I think for those who haven't read it yet, just set the scene for us a little bit. You've mentioned Marcus Valentine. He's a brilliant gynecologist with a specialization in cancer. And we meet him right at the start, and you describe him as sometimes looking like a bird of prey. I mean, he's really scary and brilliant. But just set it up for us a little bit.
Sure. Marcus Valentine is the sort of consultant of obstetrician at Jersey General Hospital. He's loved by his patients. He's the go-to doctor that almost anybody with a problem at the hospital will consult for advice. Some people find him a little bit arrogant, but hey, quite a lot of consultants are. And he's obsessed with time. He hates being late for anything. Timing is everything is like his mantra. And he's late for work one morning because his wife's delayed him, and he's driving along the main seafront road to the hospital. And he's angry. He glances down at his phone, and when he looks up, there's a red light against him and a woman running across the road. And he slams on the brakes, and she stands there protecting her midriff because we discover she's finally pregnant after years of trying. And he stops about an inch from mowing her down. And she kind of looks at him, this sort of guy in dark glasses and a black Porsche, and she goes, dickhead, and kind of runs off. He just sits there transfixed because when he was 16, he was absolutely besotted with a girl he met whilst he was at school called Lynette, and she dumped him in favor of a biker. But he's never got her out of his mind. His wife looked a little bit like her. And he looks at this woman and thinks, she looks just like Lynette could be 25 years later. Is this possible? And he literally turns the car around, drives back along the seafront, surreptitiously takes some photographs of her. And then by sheer chance, he meets her 2 weeks later at a dinner and discovers that she's a personal trainer and a very keen runner. And so he starts running, takes up running. He used to run years ago, and he loads a running app onto his phone and starts following her routes on his running app. And then, without too much of a spoiler, a situation occurs. He learns that she's got a fiance, and then the fiance has an accident, and the opportunity occurs to save the fiance's life or not.
Oh my God, there's so many wonderful complications, but I know that you also often find the source of your inspiration for books in things that have actually happened to you in real life. So where did this book come from? Moving to Jersey, yes, but what clued you into this scenario? What was it that triggered that?
Well, my wife Laura I'm a runner, but my wife Laura is a serious runner. She's done 13 marathons, kind of runs distance daily, and she uses the running app Strava, as many runners do. While we were still in Sussex, we were living out in the countryside, and she said to me one day, she said, a really strange thing happened yesterday evening. She said, I was down a country lane. It was November, it was dark. And I just, waved at a male runner coming the other way. And runners do, they're a friendly community. And he just waved back. And then I got home and there was a ping. And I noticed he started following me on Strava. I kind of recognized him from the clothes he was wearing and backpack. And then over the course of the next 2 weeks, she got really concerned because she said, he's following me every day. And she said, I'm running down remote woodland tracks and paths and things in the darkness. He'll know where I live because he can see where I start and finish my runs from. And she said, so many people, we all put so much information on social media. This might make a theme for a book. And I loved that. and and I realized it's so true. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and as you mentioned, YouTube. And, I post daily on everything. And I suddenly realized, somebody actually had malintent towards someone. The first port of call would really be to look at social media, and they could probably find out everything they needed to about their whereabouts. We don't do our privacy settings. If I was to drop my iPhone in the street and somebody could get into it, they'd see all my movements hour by hour for the last 2 years. And that fascinated me.
Absolutely. Well, you've tapped into, though, a couple of things. The idea that you can be stalked, and you can be stalked using technology, that's really kind of current anxiety. But the thing that you've matched into that is faith in the medical profession and what happens when you put your trust in the medical profession. Of course, that's all around us now in the kind of COVID situation. And I'm dealing with a friend in hospital at the moment. I've had that moment at a bed recently where I realized these two doctors weren't talking to each other and they didn't know what one had prescribed and the other one had not. And there was this lack of communication. And that fault line was immediately where I thought, who's the patient advocate? So let me ask you about the research that you did for this book. Where did that take you in terms of because I know you do a lot of research for your books, and this must have been quite comprehensive because medical knowledge seems to be very convincing.
Thank you. It was both comprehensive and mind-boggling at times. I chose to have a consultant because we do put a lot of trust in doctors. The Hippocratic Oath, the first rule of medicine is first do no harm. And yet there has been quite a considerable history of doctors doing considerable harm. The worst serial killer we've ever had in England was a family doctor, Harold Shipman. Nice, charming, bearded, bespectacled, twinkly-eyed, who just happened to like killing his patients and killed about 350 of them. You get serial killers in hospitals in England, in America, in probably every country of the world, because it's very easy for them to get away with it. Whatever it is, whether it's a power trip, they just love that power of life and death, or they're doing medical experiments. I've written a number of previous standalones, certainly medical world, and it's always fascinated me. But here, going to the world of gynecology, and Georgia McLean, who is the other central character, is in the Last Chance Saloon. She's early 40s, pregnant after years of trying. Sorry, excuse my frog.
Yep, have a quick drink. I can hear that there's a little thing there.
Finally, she's pregnant. She's got her dream. And I wanted to really go through her journey as he becomes increasingly obsessed by her, and he feels, if I could get rid of that baby, that would be one obstacle less in the way of us getting together.
Mm.
And I found I was introduced to a wonderful lady consultant gynecologist at Jersey General Hospital, Kathleen Gillis, and she got permission from the hospital chief exec for me to basically be a fly on the wall with her for as much time as I needed, and obviously with the consent of her patients. Mm. And I found her patients, quite a lot of them turned out to be fans, so that always helped, but were quite happy for me to sit there while they were talking about, really personal problems, with sort of, genital warts or whatever they had. And I was sort of sitting there at times really blushing. And then probably the most incredible moment of all my research was when there's quite a key scene in the book where Marcus Valentine does a C-section, cesarean section to deliver twins. And the couple who were having the babies allowed me to be present in the operating theatre. And I stood there during all this going on, and I watched these two tiny little humans come into the world. It was extraordinary. And also, I was quite shocked by the sheer brutality. Yes. I always thought childbirth was something a little bit gentler. Yes. But it was an extraordinary moment in my life, actually, not just in the research of the book, but I'll never forget the moment that first little baby appeared. So that was really fascinating, and I was really lucky. I think probably because not many writers in recent times have set books in Jersey, they couldn't help me enough, and I had people coming forward with ideas, and I had huge help also from the accident and emergency and trauma team. I had a wonderful expression told to me by the head of trauma at the hospital. He said, I said, when do you define a major trauma? He said, well, I really define a major trauma as when somebody arrives in the hospital in 2 ambulances.
Yeah. And the other bit followed you in.
Yeah. I love the kind of gallows humor that all the emergency services have. It's their coping mechanism. They'd go nuts sometimes without it.
Yeah, no, my sister was a nurse, and my father was a hospital administrator in the north of England. I grew up around hospitals, and I know precisely that kind of gallows humor. But what you've done is, with that research, is that you have turned it into a real page turner of a thriller. And of course, the big danger, as we know, for any crime writer doing research, is to get totally lost in the research. You've got to keep the pace up. But you write very much to be read fast. I couldn't put the book down, and I kept going, just one more chapter, because there's only 3 pages. I'll just keep going, one more chapter. I can't leave them in this situation because it's a thriller. You cannot leave the central characters in danger. You have to rescue them before the end of the book. So let me ask you about your influences in terms of your writing. Where does that style come from? Who are you? What propels you to tell a story in that way?
I guess more than anything, the biggest influence is I like to write the way that I like to read. I love books with short chapters. I mean, a classic modern writer who does that is the early Alex Cross, the James Patterson books. They're very short chapters, punchy chapters. And my old mate James Herbert, the horror writer, he also told me that if you don't bore them with the long chapters, Pete, he said they like short chapters. And he actually wrote a chapter that was one word long once. But what, seriously, I think most of us, when we're not on holiday, reading in bed at night, we're tired. You know, I pick up a book and I see the chapter's 53 pages long. I think, oh, I'll have that tomorrow. Pick up a book and it's 1.5 pages. Like, oh, I'll just read that. Oh, the next chapter is only 2 pages. Oh, the next chapter is only 4 pages. And the next thing I know, it's 3 a.m. and I'm still reading. And I love that. In my kind of influences over the years have really been manifold. I think I feel very lucky to be living now than 300 years ago, when there weren't so many writers to draw from. You know, now I've got this an enormous pot. But I guess I start with Enid Blyton. She got probably more than anybody else got me into reading. I remember I wrote to Enid Blyton once, and I said that dear Miss Blyton, I've just read your book, Five Go to Treasure Island. They spent 7 nights on this island, and not one of them went to the toilet in all that time. I'm really worried. And she wrote a very sweet letter back saying, well, dear Peter, they had gone. She said, I didn't put those bits in because I thought little boys and girls weren't interested. So, but she said, I will bear it in mind for the future. So I devoured everything else she wrote for the rest of my childhood, and the hope that one day, somewhere in one of those books, somebody will be taking a dump.
You just wanted that little edge of realism in that thriller narrative. I mean, you and I were, you know, roughly the same vintage. I was growing up in the north of England, you were growing up in the south. But Enid Blyton during the 1950s was an extraordinary influence on a whole generation in terms of loving books, loving narratives, loving adventure, loving page turners. I mean, that's what made me love reading. And then eventually, of course, I went to London University to read English and would conspicuously read Dostoevsky on the bus, you know, to try and impress people. But that wasn't what I really loved reading. I really loved Enid Blyton. So there's a snobbery around books, which I think still exists in relation to crime fiction and what we might call literary fiction. And I know in England it's a little bit stronger than it might be in Australia.
Do you know, the nicest thing anyone can say to me or to any author is, you write page turners. And I get so annoyed when I see like the Booker Prize being discussed on television. You get, you know, a couple of old stiff old crones going, I found the book almost impenetrable, but it is worth persevering, isn't it? I go, no, it fucking well isn't. Excuse my language. Books should be about pleasure. You should be about picking up a book and being drawn straight into it. Mm-hmm. And there's been so much snobbery. I mean, when I was chair of the Crime Writers Association, I made it my platform for the 2 years I had that privilege to really try and fight the corner for the crime world, because, you know, all the national newspapers, you know, they'd give a literary novel an entire page. Crime would always end up a little roundup, you know, 3 or 4, 5, 6 books in one little column. And it annoyed me so intensely, because if you look back at the whole canon of literature, you know, go back to Sophocles, you know, what was he writing? You know, if he was writing today, where would his books be? Either on the horror shelves or the crime shelves. Shakespeare wrote plays because during his time, there weren't books. I mean, there was hardly any books and hardly anybody could read, and very few people could afford books anyway. So he wanted to communicate, he wrote plays, that was the best way. But I'm certain if Shakespeare was writing today, he'd be classed as a crime writer. I mean, over half of his plays, you know, have a courtroom scene. Charles Dickens, you know, many of the greatest writers who've ever lived. I mean, even, you know, Benjamin Black, the pseudonym of John Banville for a long time. now finally he's sort of almost like come out the closet and actually written a crime novel under his own name. Wow. And he's a nice guy, but for years he's almost been embarrassed to write crime, whereas I write crime because, many years ago, I'd written 2 really bad spy thrillers because I read there was a shortage of spy thrillers. And my then wife and I got burgled, and a young detective came to the house to take fingerprints, and he saw the books. He said, well, if you ever want research help with the police, give me a call. And he was married to a detective, and they invited my wife and I to a barbecue, and there was a dozen of their friends there. All of them were cops. Traffic, response, homicide, crime scene. And just talking to these people was my, I guess, light bulb moment of my career. I thought, wow, police. Nobody sees more of human life in a 30-year career than a cop. And from that moment onwards, that was what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
I was very lucky when the police realized I was genuinely interested, and not just out to get a quick story I could sell to the paper. They started inviting me out on patrol. Yeah. It got to a point by the kind of mid-90s where I'd almost become part of the furniture of Sussex Police, and they'd phone me up and say, we're doing a raid tomorrow morning, do you want to come along? Or, we've got an exhumation at the cemetery come along at 6 o'clock in the morning. And then I was very lucky to meet this terrific young detective inspector called Dave Gaylor, who rose up through the ranks and in 2002 became promoted to Detective Chief Superintendent, Head of Major Crime for Sussex. And my publishers, Pam Macmillan, asked me if I'd ever thought of creating a detective as a central character. So I went to Dave and I said, how would you like to be a fictional cop? He loved it, and he's become my best friend. When Laura and I got married in 2015, he was best man at our wedding. He comes out to Jersey every 2 or 3 weeks. We sit down and go through the pages I've written so that I can get it really right from a detective's perspective. How would Roy really think and act?
Well, it's that procedural level, but it's also the way in which the police kind of operate on the fault lines of society. They operate where the cracks appear. So they're really the canaries in the gold mine, in a sense of sensing where a society is cracking and what's going wrong. And crime fiction pays attention to those cracks. I mean, that's what I've always thought is the real value of crime fiction, in terms of what it tells us about society.
Completely. I love the expression of the fault lines. I think that's going to appear in a future Roy Grace novel. It's a great line, and you're absolutely right. And they are also a major part of the glue that holds civilized life together.
Yeah.
And they are, in England right now, they are really under duress. The whole kind of political correctness. There was a cop suspended in the Met Police last year for telling his team he wanted them to be whiter than white. They're walking on eggshells now, and everyone's wearing a body cam. When I was writing my last Roy Grace novel, Find Them Dead, some of it set out in the Met, and I spent a lot of time with the Met Police, and they're being abused all the time by youths, many of them, every different race, and the police have to be so careful what they say back because everything is being filmed, and then ends up out of context, on YouTube. And there was outrage. There were moped gangs going around throwing acid into people's faces and stealing their mobile phones. So they're destroying somebody's life for a $30 phone. And the police finally got permission. And then they dodged the police by going down alleyways. And I was out with the team just when they got permission from the head of the Met to knock these blighters off. And we actually hit the back wheel of one and sent him skittering on the pavement. And of course, then they're terrified, is he going to die? Are they going to be held up on a murder charge? It's crazy.
Look, we're going to go to questions from our audience, and you can ask a question anytime now, but I noticed in the chat that someone actually is very interested in what's behind you, Peter, in terms of the, I think you've got police memorabilia behind you of what sort?
I have. I'll lift up you've got a cop standing in the corner. I have a collection of hats, including a Western Australian police hat, which you should be able to see. I put that there in your honor for today. but it's in my collection on permanent display.
Right.
And I have, all around my office, I have police memorabilia, badges, truncheons, another cop standing in the corner, far corner.
So do you go hunting for these, or do they just arrive?
They're right. You know, I think over the years, police that I go out with, I've been out with police in many countries of the world, including Russia, which probably the most scared I've been. We actually got shot at in a police car in Russia. That was not quite as much fun as I'd hoped. But police know that I collect memorabilia, and I always try to meet police wherever I travel on book promotion.
Yeah.
So when I've been in Australia, I've been out with the police in Melbourne, Perth, Sydney. I mean, and I've been out with them in New Zealand. And you learn so much about the culture of a country through talking to its police, as much as anything else. The nature of crime. I remember learning about the gangs of Melbourne, which I didn't know about.
Yeah.
And that was all completely fascinating. And I ended up using some of that in a Roy Grace book.
Yeah.
Over the years, police just give me things. And often when police retire, they'll send me their warrant cards and things like that.
Mm. Fascinating. After I did an interview with Michael Connolly, his homicide detective contacted me and said how much he'd enjoyed the interview. And I think I was more thrilled by being contacted by a real homicide detective than I was by anything else, which shows that as readers and as writers, we sit on the edges, don't we? And it's when we come up against it and when we experiencing it. Crime fiction enables us to look at our societies, through a kind of aesthetic frame. It enables us to look at it as a safe distance, but still to contemplate what's wrong.
Totally. Just making that your voice is a little bit muffled.
Okay.
Oh, that's better. Yeah.
Is that better? I'll lean forward.
That's great. Yeah, thanks. So I missed just what you just said. Sorry.
I just said that crime fiction provides us with that frame as readers and writers to look at the problems that are in our society that we don't necessarily, from our social position, encounter in any way. It gives us a safe place to look at what's wrong without
completely. And I think that I know people have all that kind of different kinds of views about the police, and they do vary in different countries. I mean, in France, they hate the police, whereas in England, still by and large, the police are respected by most people, as they are in Germany and Scandinavia. But Italy, Spain, they hate them. It very much depends on the attitude of the police, and also to what extent the police are paid. But you're right. I mean, the police in England these days, I mean, when I go out, in normal times, I go out with a response crew every 2 or 3 weeks to keep up to speed with what's happening, and also just to hear their stories. And on every single shift I've ever been on in the last 30 odd years, at some point we end up at a domestic fight. At some point we end up with a missing person, and almost always rescuing a vulnerable person. So I mean, the police are, as much as they're fighting crime and solving crime, they are also the major social workers.
Yeah.
In the UK, massive drain on their resources.
Yeah. Okay, we've got another question coming in there from Alison. Thanks, Alison. And she says, "Hello, Peter. What are the benefits and disadvantages of working on a standalone novel in the same time frame as a Roy Grace novel? Do you find it enhances your writing enjoyment?"
Hi, Alison. Great question. Alison's a great writer too. I've read some of her work. She's brilliant. Read her. There are certain Roy Grace novels that, if you like, there are themes that I want to explore where I want to write really from the protagonist and victim standpoint entirely, such as Find Them Dead. I did think of putting it into a Roy Grace novel, but I felt that then the whole police procedure would have kind of got in the way of the tension of is Georgie McLean going to be okay, or is Marcus Valentine going to succeed? And I felt it didn't need the police. Almost police would have taken some of that tension away. It's not to say I don't write tension in the Roy Grace novels, but it is, when I write a Roy Grace novel, it takes me longer because the police have procedures and ways of doing things. So I have a constant check and balance, not just with the real Roy Grace, Dave Gaylor, but with the whole network of police. I'm constantly sending pages, chapters to the digital forensics units, to the mortuary, to hide different officers in different disciplines of the police, saying, "Have I got this right?" So, whereas with a novel like I Follow You, obviously I've got to get the medical side of it right, but I can have much more kind of free form in that sense. So I like it. So I can to explore themes that just wouldn't work with the Roy Grace. I'm working on a new standalone that's inspired by my kind of family's history of coming over from Austria as Jewish refugees on my mother's side. And again, that wouldn't work as a Roy Grace novel, but equally, I love writing Roy Grace. I am about 10 days from finishing the 17th Roy Grace, which will be out next spring, summer.
Well, that's interesting because Sharon was just asking, are there any more Roy Grace in the pipeline? And we know the answer to that one. I think there's also a TV series, right?
There is. That next year, there are 2 Roy Graces. There's a Roy Grace novel called Leave You Dead. And then I've got a novella I've written called Wish You Were Dead, which will be out next June. And then the Roy Grace TV series tomorrow wraps at the first episode, which is Dead Simple. They're filming right now at the moment in Brighton. They're filming the first 2 Roy Grace novels this year, and then they're going to be doing 3 to 4 a year next year and onwards. So they literally they've got 1 day of filming left on Dead Simple, and then they go straight into Looking Good Dead. And the wonderful John Sim is playing Roy Grace, and Richie Campbell is playing Glenn Branson. And what I'm really happy about is there's not just great screen chemistry between them, they've become mates. They're having fun offset. And that was so critical to me always of the Roy Grace books working on television, to have that chemistry between Roy and Glenn, because they're such good buddies.
So John Sim I know from Life on Mars. Where would I know Roy from?
Glenn Branson.
Yes.
He's been in all kinds of. He was in The Hunchback of Notre Dame as well on television. He's got quite a. You'd recognise his face instantly. It's Richard Campbell. Got a really. He looks to me just like the original Glenn Branson that I first met.
Right.
And I love that John is really thinking about things as well. Like in Dead Simple, when we first meet Roy Grace, we learn that his wife Sandy had vanished off the face of the earth some years earlier, and all these years while he functions as a homicide detective, he's still dogged by the mystery, can't move on in his life. And for a joke, Glenn finally sets him up on a blind date, and Roy goes to meet this, which turns out to be the date from hell, but he meets her in a pub. And just before they shot the scene, John Sim emailed me and he said, "Should I be wearing my wedding ring or should I take it off?" And I love that he'd thought about that.
How lovely. And were you involved in this script writing process at all? I mean, how closely have they stayed with the books?
I was incredibly involved. I have to say, I mean, I've had 3 previous books filmed in the past, which I was never very happy with. But ITV, who are making this, have just been fantastic. I get phone calls from them every single day regarding casting, regarding script. Russell Lewis is actually writing the scripts. He writes Endeavour. He's just brilliant and the loveliest human being. The producer, Kian Murray, is just amazing as well. I've never felt so happy or engaged with a crew before.
That's
yeah, and I've seen, I see the weekly assemblies every week, and I think Roy Grace fans are going to be in for a treat.
Oh well, something to look forward to. We need another good police British police procedural, definitely. You know, Vera can only go so far. We need.
True. Hmm.
We've got a lovely question from Lisa, who says, "How long did it take you to write I Follow You? Because it's such a fast read. How long did it take to write?"
Hi, Lisa. It took me a Roy Grace novel from the time I write the first line to the last line of the first draft is around 7.5 months. I Follow You took me about 5 months. So it's quite a difference in terms of less time having to get everything right with the police. I was able to focus really on one place, much more with the hospital. But the editing process is invariably a long one also because it goes through several stages of edit. So by the time the actual final finished book, the one that's kind of there, is done, and actually in my hands is the best part of a year from the time I've written that first line.
Yeah. Okay, and we've got another question from Kim here. Peter, have you got any tips for us writing hopefuls?
Yeah, I've got several, Kim. If we do actually have a kind of a little writing handbook, which we could happily send you if you wanted to email me. You can get the email off my website. If you go on my YouTube channel, again, you can get the link to my website. It's peterjames.com. You'll see over 100 authors, some really successful, some up and coming, giving writing tips, including George R. R. Martin. But my best tip of all is to consider writing as a craft. You know, if you were going to be a car mechanic, what you would do is you would take apart a car and its engine to see how it worked and put it back together. If you're going to be a doctor, you'd have your own cadaver and you'd dissect your cadaver and see how every single bit of that worked. What I did when I started out, and I still do if I come across an amazing book, is I dissect the book. I literally take the book apart and don't feel ashamed. I think all writers, we learn from our peers. You know, Graham Greene's Brighton Rock was a massive influence for me, as also was Silence of the Lambs. And I think the most important tip of all is read, reread, and reread those books that have been hugely successful that you really love and the kind of book that you would like to write and learn from it.
That's interesting. And you mentioned Brighton Rock, and you mentioned Silence of the Lambs. Are there any other crime authors that you read now and go from there?
I always love it when I get sent many books every week to read for quotes, and I physically can't read them all, but I'm a big first sentence, first paragraph person. If the first paragraph kind of hooks me, I remember, I think Claire McIntosh's first book landing on that pile and reading it and going, wow, this is just bloody brilliant. And I love it when that happens. My kind of canon of authors I regularly read, Ian Rankin, Michael Connolly. I love Linwood Barclay, the Canadian. Michael Rowbottom, I love. I think he's great. Peter Temple's a really good writer too, brilliant writer. And I love also sort of some of the classics. I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to Lee Child a couple of years ago, and we discovered that one of our early influences was a writer who's not many people really know these days, John D. MacDonald.
Yes.
And he was an American writer, and he had this character, a private eye called Travis McGee.
Travis McGee. I've got a pile of them in the other room.
They all had a color in the title.
Yes.
And Travis McGee lived on a houseboat in the Florida Keys called the Busted Flush, and drove a Rolls Royce that had been converted into a pickup truck. And he got things back for people. And having grown up in the mold of Agatha Christie, suddenly reading this completely fresh, I thought, wow, you can actually really have fun. And I did. I remember it's evening, so I can be a little bit rude, right? I for years I didn't think it was possible to become a successful crime writer in England, because you had to very much kind of write in the tradition of the Agatha kind of Christie golden age genre, which was you start chapter 1, a dead body, preferably in the library of a country house. You have to have a frisson of sex, a little bit of violence, a little bit of religion. And so I did come up with, I thought, was the perfect opening line that would encompass all of these. Fuck me, I've been shot, said the vicar's wife, as her knickers hit the library floor of Ponsonby Towers with a crash.
Whereas my husband's favorite opening line, being an American, was, I dropped to one knee and fired twice.
Love it. I love it.
So we must be coming up to the last question, I think. We've got one there which says, what books are you reading now or have you enjoyed this year? But I'm just letting people know that we're getting very close to the end here now. But what about Sarah's question? What books are you reading now or that you've enjoyed this year?
I've just been reading Ellie Griffiths, who's in fact a Brighton writer. I love her writing. She's brilliant. I don't always get to read every book I want to read, but I always try and read her books. I quite enjoyed the Richard Osman's book. It's kind of a bit of fun. I'm actually halfway through Ian Rankin's latest.
Yes.
A Song for the Dark Times. He's a lovely writer. I always kind of find his books a kind of rich tapestry of character, and I love those.
Richard Osman, of course, we've seen a little bit of in a quiz show in Australia, but he's not such a big figure here. But he's written that lovely book, Thursday Club.
Club, yeah.
And it's set in a retirement home. And I've actually given it to a lot of people in my age group, saying you need to read this. It's very funny. Oh yes, I agree with you about the Richard Osman.
I'm also reading. I listen to audiobooks a lot now, particularly if I'm kind of running or even just cooking. I have a kind of traditional Sunday evenings. I always make a big vegetable stew, and it takes about 2 hours. So I listen to audiobooks, and I'm listening to Humankind at the moment, which is it's a fascinating book because it takes the argument that actually a lot of people are saying that we are fundamentally bad, the human race, which is why we're in the mess we're in. And he actually takes the view and says, no, we're not. We're actually fundamentally decent. And he goes into, talks about Lord of the Flies and how that presented a bleak view of people, a bunch of kids trapped on an island will end up becoming pretty much savages. He found a real Lord of the Flies, a group of well-educated teenage boys from Fiji who got stranded on an island for a year and a half, and they'd actually organized themselves properly. If two of them had an argument, they made them go and stand at opposite ends of the island. And the book is really interesting because it gives a different slant on what we kind of see in the news every day and have thrown at us by the media all the time. Yeah. And it actually, me too. I do actually believe that people are fundamentally decent. I know most cops during the course of their career become increasingly cynical because they're only ever seeing the rubbish. They're only ever seeing tragedy and sadness and horrible people. People don't go to the police because they're happy.
No.
But I think, I do, and I try in my books to be uplifting as well as dark sometimes.
Well, we have to encompass all of that. We haven't got to the paranormal side. There's so much more to talk about here, but we've got one last question, which was from Penn Wright, who said, could you read the opening line of I Follow You? Have you got a copy to hand?
I have.
You have. It's brilliant. I just looked. Opening line.
The opening line of I Follow You is, timing is everything.
That's perfect. And good night. Everybody, it's been such a joy having you here, such a joy talking to Peter. We've got so much more we could talk about, but I really encourage you to get hold of this. It's an absolute thriller. a real joy. And now that you've heard Peter talk about it, it'll just be so augmented by that. And follow Peter on YouTube. And if you haven't read his back catalogue, go back there. I want to read the Cold Hill House books, the paranormal ones, because I had a mother that was Fae. I want to read those. So look, thank you so much, Peter, for being a guest of Dymocks, and thank you.
Thank you, Sue, for being such a great fun to talk to. And thank you, everybody who's tuned in and watching.
Good night. Bye, everybody.